The company only wanted us to sign up for 1 year at a time. At the time, I never really realized why. And after signing up, we had to go through, well, I was still brand new as a flight attendant. And when I found out that I could sign up for the military flights, they were called MAC, Military Airlift Command. We had to go through and get all the shots that the servicemen did. And safety was taught as far as not to ever deplane the aircraft in Vietnam. And we just had certain protocols to follow. They gave us an identification card that listed us as a second lieutenant. And when we asked why, because they said in case we were killed or captured, and if we were captured, they'd have to treat us as officers. But of course, we knew better. So that was my initial in signing up to fly that. And I really wanted to do that because I knew I wasn't going to go in the service, but it was like my way of doing duty and serving.
No, so this was completely voluntary though,
Yes,
during these flights?
yes, it was completely voluntary. It was almost like we had to sign away if anything happened to us. Our family couldn't sue the airline. So yes, it
Mm.
was all volunteer.
Your motivation then, it sounds like, when you were thinking about whether you wanted to volunteer for this,
Hmm.
your motivation was primarily, this is one way I can serve, I can be part of the mission.
Yes, definitely that was my reason. Hmm.
What was the mission? 69, 70, 71. Obviously, at this stage, we're very late in the war. Some of the, well, I think the biggest protests of the war take place during this period.
Hmm.
This is a really tough time in the country's history. Um, at that time, what was this thing in Vietnam all about? What was the mission that you were signing up to be part of?
Well, I didn't even know where Vietnam was, other than it was far, far away.
Mm.
Um, you know, I guess when I signed up, I knew that I was going to be traveling all across the Pacific. I knew what was going on in the States, the riots, the demonstrations, all of that. But I really didn't let that be a part of my life because I wanted to serve. And these young soldiers, and mainly they were 18 and 19-year-olds. Yes, I had a few that were in their early 20s. I was in my early 20s when I signed up for this. And, they were right out of boot camp. My focus was on them. Continental would go up and down the coastlines to pick up our soldiers. We left LAX with an empty aircraft. We ferried, our aircraft to a base, a military base, picked up 165 soldiers. The aircraft we flew was a 707 320 series, and it had 165 seats on it with no divider. That was my first walk on the aircraft, and seeing no divider, and it was just all these seats. They had either been drafted, most of them drafted, and of course you had the percentage of the enlisted, and they were ready to go. They were ready to serve. They had no idea either how far Vietnam was. So on our flight leaving LA, our first stop would be Hawaii. They would remain with the aircraft. We got off the aircraft and had long layovers in Hawaii on the beach of Waikiki. And that's when I realized I'm going to enjoy these flights because of where we're going. Little did I know how much these flights were going to affect my life. And then from Hawaii, we flew to the Philippines. And then we got off, they remained. And then the last flight, when I got my phone call, it was going to be Tan Son Nhut, Saigon. And I thought, well, this is what I signed up for. I'm ready. Uh, but that first flight landing in Vietnam was very emotional for me. The reality of war was evident, and then as all of these young men deplaned, and remember we were told never to deplane the aircraft, and everybody was off except for me. but I was glad because I knew I wanted to cry because it was just too emotional for me. And so I went up into the flight deck, no pilots were up there, and closed the door, and I let myself cry as I looked at them, the soldiers on the tarmac. And I told myself, if you're going to do these flights, you can't cry. And I didn't. I never did. No matter what I saw and no matter what I heard. I just kind of kept it all in.
You said that the reality of war was evident. How so?
Mhm.
What did you see from the air on the ground that drove home to you that, this plane had arrived in a war zone? Of course, you know that going in, but what did you see or experience or hear that made that concrete, that, this plane is on the tarmac in a war zone?
Right. It was pretty evident because of all the military vehicles on the ground. That's the easy visual thing, but flying in was evident. We flew into Tan Son Nhut, Benoit, Da Nang, Cameron Bay. Da Nang I hated because we had a window in which we could fly in, and that was like between 3 and 5 in the morning, and you visually could see the bombs going off on the ground as you looked out the window.
Wow.
And after my first flight, the flight attendant said, we always go down to the bottom of the stairs wherever we land in Vietnam, and we say our goodbyes, to our soldiers. And we couldn't use the same verbiage that we did on domestic flights. It was totally different. We knew they were going to war. It wasn't until after my first flight that I realized many of them weren't coming back. It just, I don't know why I thought men could go to war and all of them could come back, but that didn't happen. And so visually, yes, we could see what was going on in war. And then, of course, the soldiers on the trips back home would tell us. Most of them were kind of in, I want to say, a little bit of shock when they came back on the flights. They were so happy they made it. They survived, their year in Vietnam. And anyway, so that was the beginning of when I started hearing all the stories.
So in some of these flights, then you recall being able to see from the windows, battles taking place or artillery rounds going out or tracers and that kind of thing.
Yeah. When they came back and started telling us what they went through, and that most of their buddies in their units did not make it, that reality became stronger and stronger as we did it. And you know we were young. Back then you couldn't be married, you couldn't have had children as a flight attendant, so we were all single. And on our layovers, which sometimes were days, um, we partied hard and we drank a lot. And we dated either the soldiers at every one of the bases or we dated our pilots. And when I look back at it now, I realized what we were doing was so emotional that we didn't want to think about those emotions. And so I think that's why we ended up, partying hard and
Mm.
dating, and that lifestyle kind of took place. And so when we landed in Vietnam, yes, the company did not want us to deplane, but we did. And in Da Nang, when you were on the ground, you could feel the bombings. It was close. And we had some captains that said, we're getting out of here. And they made that announcement and used words that get in your seat and strap down. We're leaving. And so, we had those episodes, and
And
you know,
this is when the plane was empty, or this is when you had troops?
full
Okay, yeah.
troops taking off in Vietnam. Yeah. You know, there were bullet holes found in our fuselage. You know, we brought back a few of the fallen soldiers in our cargo. Um, you know, so there was evidence of war all the time going on. And when the company did not want us to deplane or step outside the aircraft in Vietnam, not even to step out on the stairs that were brought up to the aircraft, you know, we found out later, I did, um, that a flight attendant had been shot in the foot. She was not killed. But now I realize that's why the company did not want us to step outside the aircraft or even be in the door to say goodbye. But, you know, doing it that long, um, it was okay for us. We wanted to do what we did. Cameron Bay was quite beautiful. It was just ironic to think we have a war going on here. My brother was there, and he said that he worked in the administration in the hospital, but I was able to see him 3 times for a very short time on the ground. We cleaned our own airplanes because we didn't let anybody on the aircraft to clean. So we cleaned it before we turned around and left. And when I would be able to see my brother, the other flight attendants did the cleaning so that I could be with my brother. It was very special. I remember one particular soldier going over to Vietnam, and we had a conversation. And then coming back, he was on my flight. And he said he was the only one that survived in his unit. And that was hard. He was really struggling with that. And I just let him talk to me and share, you know. So yeah, that was hard. And then we'd go to the hospital in Clark Air Force Base, and
The Philippines.
yeah, in the Philippines. Thank you. And we if the soldiers didn't drink open their milk carton or open their little bag of a brownie, we saved them, and we would take off 2 bagfuls. And before we even went to our hotel, mind you, we'd been up a long time, but we wanted to go to the hospital right away and give the milk and the brownies to the soldiers that were there. And I remember this particular young man, he had a curtain draped before you could go into his room. And I said, knock, knock, may I come in? And he goes, I don't think you want to come in. And I said, I'm okay if you're okay. And he said, okay. And so, you know, opened the curtain and went in. And he had been, his whole side, his right side, had been just blown to pieces. And he was laying there. And I know he had to be in excruciating pain. But I just focused on his eyes, talked to him, and I never forgot him. A lot of the veterans said, you know, that they met God in a foxhole. And they says, you don't spend a night in a foxhole and not pray, even if you've never prayed, even if you don't even know God. You prayed, God, let me survive. And if I survive, I'll believe in you. And so a lot of them shared that. And
How would you describe the general difference between, well, I guess there are a couple questions here. The general difference between flights to Vietnam and flights from, in terms of how the troops sort of carried themselves. And of course, you have all these individuals with their own personalities, but I wonder if there's a general difference when you think about the flights to and the flights from. And then when I'm thinking about the flights to, also there's that first leg, the West Coast to Hawaii, Hawaii to the Philippines, Philippines now to Vietnam as you're getting closer. So maybe focus first on those on the flights to Vietnam. How generally would you describe sort of the spirit of things aboard the plane on these series of flights, and did that spirit change as the flight got closer to Vietnam? Because most of these guys, I mean, some will be returning for second tours,
Hmm.
but most this is going to be their one and only tour. How would you describe that generally?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, picking them up, on the coast of California, they were ready. They're ready to serve. They were up, joked, messed around with one another. And then the closer we got to Vietnam, it became somber. They knew this was the last leg. They knew now they're going to go to war. They knew nothing about it. Some of them said, when they got there, they deplaned and they were bussed in to wherever their base was. And all they had was this wire mesh on the bus because they didn't want grenades to be thrown into the bus. And they had no weapons until they got to their base in Vietnam. So those stories were shared. You could see the change continually as the closer we got there. And yeah. And then coming back, wow, big difference. These were young men who went over there. These were older men who came back, who saw things they didn't even want to share with us. I don't think we could have taken it at that time. It was a different type of war that they shared with us coming back. But you asked, the visual change, absolutely. Absolutely, you could see that change. And some of them were so quiet, they didn't even want to talk about it. And we never asked them. We let them tell us. We never asked them. And a lot of them would go right to sleep because probably they hadn't slept very well in a year. When you live with fear 24/7, your life is totally changed. And so we let them sleep. And then when we were ready to serve them, we would, we didn't want to make a PA, but we sprayed perfume on us and walked through the cabin and woke them up that way. Yeah.
That'll wake them up. They haven't smelled that in a while.
Yeah, that's
Um,
right.
you grew up in a family that was that couldn't hear. Your sign language was your first language, and part of sign language is reading not just the signs but the facial expressions.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm imagining, you can pull up into your mind's eye, some of the many hundreds of faces you saw on those return flights. Um, and growing up in the world you grew up in, you become a very good reader of facial expressions and
Mm-hmm.
the eyes, the eyes carry their own message. What sort of messages, without even speaking to these military vets who had spent a year for Marines, 13 months in Vietnam, what kind of messages could you just read in their faces without them saying anything?
Hmm. Realizing how horrible war is. After 2 years, I knew I needed to rest. I knew I needed to make a change because it was affecting me big time. So I changed to domestic. And I remember on one of my domestic flights, as we prepared for landing, every passenger has to be in their upright position with the seatbelt on. And this gentleman was laying down. He had all three seats and he was laying down in them. So I reached in on his shoulder to touch his shoulder to wake him up. He woke up, lunged towards me, ready to choke me. And I knew he was a Vietnam veteran. I just knew it. And I said, "You're okay. It's okay. You're okay." I just kind of calmed him down, and he was upset that he did that towards me, but I got it. I understood. And anyway, I never forgot that passenger.
You're in not just Vietnam, but Southeast Asia, Thailand,
Mm-hmm.
if I remember correctly. You flying to
Mm-hmm.
Thailand?
We
So
flew everywhere, everywhere.
what impact, as you look back on it, the United States, of course, has this major operation going on in South Vietnam. We
Mm-hmm.
also, at the same time, have bases in Thailand that are supporting that. We have B-52s flying out of Guam. We've got
Yes,
the Navy and the Marines and the Air Force in the Philippines.
yes,
And so really this thing involves much of Southeast Asia. I don't think Guam's part of Southeast Asia, but the Philippines and Thailand. As you look back on it, how did you see the impact of U.S. military operations in Southeast Asia as a whole, if that question makes sense, in the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam?
I think that's a good question. All I know is that Continental at the time we were so small of an airline domestically. And then when the war came evident and we started transporting the soldiers, we we built up financially. We ordered more airplanes. We grew um, in a good way, even though it was the war. And I would say with Asia and all your other countries that we went into, uh, for them, it was building up because we would bring soldiers in to all those places and they would either go through whatever training or whatever they needed to in that transition, would only build up financially all of those countries. And so I saw the war as a plus for them, even though I hated the war, but I saw the plus that we were helping the economy. And unfortunately, wars do that to some degree. So, yeah, the other countries profited.
So in your perspective, I mean, and you were with Continental for, is it 40 years?
Mm-hmm.
So in your experience then, um, you saw Continental um, as it's flying these missions, and of course, as being paid by the government to fly these missions, that's something that helped to position Continental to become a major airline. You know,
Yes, it did. We had a very good reputation. We really did. And
um,
especially flying the military flights because we were all quite young. Whereas some of the other airlines, you had to have had at least 10 years seniority in order to fly the MAC flights.
I've heard this from vets. Some vets speak of the very young flight attendants, and others say, well, the flight attendants on our flight were more seasoned, let's say. They'd been at it a bit longer. So
Right.
different airlines had different policies.
Yeah, Tiger Airlines and Continental, and I'm trying to think of whether Frontier, but we were all pretty young. And I'm really very thankful that Continental hired me and not American Airlines because with American you had to have 10 years seniority.
So suppose you had to get rid of all of your memories of those 2 years of flying troops to and from Vietnam, um, except for one. There's one memory of those 2 years you get to keep. All the rest have to go. Um, which memory do you think you would keep?
I believe it would be that young soldier who was on both my flights going and coming back. During those 2 years, I transported over 70,000 troops in those 2 years. It's a lot of troops. And yes, those conversations that I had, those all kind of stayed with me. But that one young man, when he came back and shared that he was the only one who survived in his unit, whew, that was pretty powerful.